Hello! Welcome to the start of the Fire Emblem Sync Marathon. In this series, I will be playing through all the mainline Fire Emblem games, but unlike most marathons, I will not be playing in chronological order. Rather, I will play the games all at once. To do so, I have personally split the chapters of each game into 25 different parts, and I will move on to the next game right after completing what I allotted for that game's part. Each part will be its own video, and my hope is that by jumping from game to game, I will be able to analyze various aspects of the series, with standard gameplay of each title readily available for comparison. The first part will allow us to look at how each game opens, and if its first maps serve as good tutorials for both how to play Fire Emblem in general, and to interact with the title's new mechanics. I can't say that my playstyle is representative of all Fire Emblem players, but I will be making some choices that reflect either common playstyles of the community, or how the game seemed to be intended to be played. I'll be playing all games in classic mode, but I am willing to reset a chapter if the map doesn't play out how I wanted, including if a character dies. I've planned out the teams for minigames to include popular builds or references to units in other games, and I want to see those plans through to the end of the series. I will be playing on the difficulty mode I am most comfortable with considering my experience with each game. For most, this does mean the highest difficulty available, but I will not be subjecting myself to, say, Awakening's Lunatic or New Mysteries Lunatic Reverse. As for my personal playstyle, I always train a full team with the final map's deployment size in mind. That is to say, I will not be low-manning. This may be a bold declaration, but I would also like to play all the maps up front, meaning no one-turning maps with warp or rescue strats. This will make maps like Conquest's Endgame and Thracia's Late Game pretty rough, but it'll make games like Three Houses more engaging by playing the maps as intended. I also have other personal conditions for properly completing a map, such as visiting every village and house, getting all bonus rewards from saving green units, and opening chests with thieves rather than purchasable keys. I understand you don't need to do these things to beat the game, but I personally find them to make for a much more satisfying experience. In a similar vein, I won't be using any of the game's paid DLC, since some of the DLC makes the games a lot easier, and I want to work with the resources that every player is expected to have. I will avoid discussing major spoilers from other games within each section, and major spoilers will only be discussed as they become relevant in their own section. I myself have not played through any of the Arcanea games or Gaiden, so FE1 through 3 and 11 through 12 will be mostly blind playthroughs for me. If there's a game you want to experience for yourself blindly, or if you are just otherwise uninterested in seeing certain games, I will include timestamps so you can skip around to your liking. That being said, let's look back and begin the marathon, starting with Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light, released for the NES in 1990. Instead of an opening cinematic when loading up the game, there's just the class roll, which I personally am not a huge fan of, since it only gives vague descriptions of the classes and their stat spread. For someone completely unfamiliar with the series though, it might be exciting to see the variety of fun tools they'll get to play with, and as the first game in the series, I think it is a logical inclusion. After a very brief opening cutscene, you are immediately thrown into the first chapter. I think this level is actually fairly effective at giving the player an opportunity to figure out how to play. The layout is fairly straightforward, but the way the map curves makes it feel interesting. You also get to experiment with many actions on your first turn that don't just involve moving forward. You're taught to visit villages with Marth, someone can go shopping at the armory, or visit houses that reference game mechanics, and you can see how combat works against a thief that starts near your units. As you progress through the map, you get plenty of opportunities to team up for kills. Most iconically, Jagen can set up for units like Marth and Sheeta that have poor combat but more room to grow. Kain and Abel have similar performance against the pirates as Jagen, while only being a little frailer, so there's not much room to mess up if you just have the high movement Cavaliers run forward, while the weaker Marth, Sheeta, and Gordon pick up kills in the back. This is of course what I did, spreading out kills amongst the latter three trainees fairly evenly. While I believe it is optimal to focus on Sheeta so she can get a faster start to becoming a strong flying combat unit, I figured I would give Marth and Gordon a chance, while they can still get easy kills. I did focus on giving kills to Kain over Abel, as I believe one strong Cavalier is better than two decent ones. I tried not to give Jagen any kills, since he really doesn't need to, and doesn't gain much from them, but unfortunately he immediately crit a pirate and also unexpectedly one-runted the archer. Off to a great start. Once you get halfway through the map, there's an interesting moment where some pirates approach you from the sea in the north. I found this moment to be a bit surprising, and I had to think on my feet to create a defensive line on the shores to fend them off. In reality, they're not that threatening, but to keep the lower movement units like Marth and Gordon from getting teamed up against all of them, it felt satisfying to block them off in such a way that also let me give kills to the trainees. Once you do get to the end, there's another village for Marth to get, and Rift joins the party to heal you up before fighting the boss. Though, to be honest, I felt he joined a little late in the map and didn't have any meaningful contributions in the end. The boss was fairly easy to kill with a combination of Doga and Kain, but still more threatening than the other pirates, serving as a safe introduction to bosses. Marth then seizes, and after another very short sequence of dialogue, the chapter is over. Overall, I felt this was a pretty clean experience, and did a good job at providing the player an opportunity to try out the mechanics of the game. The conveyance of some specific mechanics, such as Marth needing to be the one to visit villages and seas, felt a little glossed over, but I felt it would be easy for new players to learn the mechanics of movement and combat on their own. I will say, however, that the controls of the game definitely lived up to their poor reputation. I had some foreknowledge of how they worked, and even then, it was annoying to move units around, check stats, and trade items. This encouraged me to just move units forward and hope for the best when it came to setting up kills. It wasn't too bad for the first map, which specifically allows for a less thought-out strategy, but going forward, I am worried that the controls will interfere with the ability and desire to interact with the game on a more methodical level. Narratively, the game also left much to be desired. The short cutscenes are serviceable as a frame for the gameplay, but as mentioned, the gameplay can be a bit tedious, and I don't think the class role and limited dialogue make for a particularly strong hook on their own. Next up is Gaiden, released in 1992. While on the same console as Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light, this game stands out by introducing and giving a twist on several mechanics, which the game makes apparent right from the start. I also feel it has a more unique hook, with an opening cinematic of scrolling text that sets the scene for the world and its two different nations, rather than a class role. The lack of visuals and speed of the scrolling does make it a little hard to follow in effect, but I appreciate the attempt to draw players into the story, which I believe is a little more fleshed out than its predecessor. The game begins by showing off the new feature of overworld exploration. It adds some depth to the introductory dialogue, as you get to physically move Alm back and forth between Mysa and Luca to hear from both sides before setting off on your journey. You also get the ability to interact with the rest of the starting cast, which adds some flavor to both the scene and the characters. After leaving the village, not only do you get to see the world map, but the upcoming battles are located on the map, so you can physically see where your journey is taking you. These are fairly simple elements, and though I may be biased from playing the Echoes remake, I think they do a strong job at drawing players into the game, despite the limitations of the NES. Getting into the gameplay, the change in the weapon system was noticeable right away, and made the tactics much easier to get into. By default, units just attack with their raw stats, and down the line are limited to equipping one item that can slightly manipulate their stats. For the first map, Brim Woods, this made it feasible to do calculations before attacking, which was helpful for setting up kills for the villagers. The map is pretty small, but still gives the player a chance to experiment with the basic mechanics of movement, combat, and terrain. There are two convenient forest tiles that Alm and Luca can reach, and while they don't strictly need them to perform well, it does give an opportunity to show off their benefits, and preventing the enemies from moving onto them means you can move the weaker villagers onto them turn 2 to help them see some enemy phase combat in their journey to reaching level 3 for promotion. Unfortunately, here is where a major critique of Gaiden comes up: enemy healing AI. When enemies are low on HP, they will move to a nearby healing tile until they're ready to fight again. While smarter enemy AI is certainly a good way to encourage better strategy, this is a particularly frustrating method that extends gameplay as you chase down weakened enemies. In Rimwoods, this was noticeable for me as I used some combination of Alm, Luca, and Grey to weaken many enemies with the hope they would attack into Robin or Cliff, perhaps miss due to utilizing the forest tile, then die. Unfortunately, healing AI led the enemies to just run away, so Cliff missed out on a couple kills. The second battle in Thief Woods was similarly annoying, as Alm and Luca struggled to fight the archer while it ran towards the healing tile, taking cover in the forest itself. Grey was surprisingly good at taking hits and setting up kills for Cliff and Robin on the right, but it felt weird not having Alm on the right and fighting the boss, like I normally do in Echoes. Despite its mechanical differences and new features compared to Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light, I felt that the first maps of Gaiden performed a similar role in giving good maps to mess around with the mechanics on their own. The simplified mechanics and smaller maps of the Gaiden, however, make for a more streamlined process, and its greater emphasis on the world and even characters got me hooked to keep playing. The controls of the NES and new healing AI make it far from perfect, however. First in the lineup of the SNES games, we have Mystery of the Emblem from 1994, and the change in console is immediately appreciated. The opening cinematic now supplements its world-building narration with some solid art, there is a more detailed map, and unit portraits convey a more compelling image of the character. Even though this title sees the removal of the overworld, the first cutscenes and dialogue at the beginning of Book 2 do a good job at setting up the post-war narrative, so even though I didn't have the complete context of everyone's story, there was enough of an overview to follow. I felt the setting was a pretty cool starting point, and I'm interested to see where it goes. Mystery of the Emblem splits itself into two parts, Book 1 and Book 2. As far as I'm aware, Book 1 is a close remake of FE1, while the original content of the game is all in Book 2. Thankfully, this is possible to do without playing Book 1 first. This is obviously convenient for players who have already played FE1, but it also means anyone could pick up Book 2 as their first Fire Emblem experience, and as such, I have to judge the first maps as tutorials, despite technically occurring halfway through the game. Unfortunately, Book 2 does not have a great start. To be fair, the first section of the map is serviceable, giving a group of low-leveled fighters to experiment with combat. Also, the controls of the game are much better, and you can quickly move units and check stats. That being said, the combat wasn't very inspiring, with the Jigen-like unit being explicitly presented as a unit that kills enemies on his own, rather than helping the others. I sent Draug out to weaken some enemies turn 1, and did my best to set up for kills for Luke, who I personally found the most appealing of the new units, but it sometimes was a little awkward. This was partly due to the new mechanic of dismounting, in which mounted units seem to be locked into lances until they dismount and get locked into swords. I immediately dismounted the Cavaliers because I thought their swords would be more accurate, but nothing in the first part of the map alone specifically points the player to do so. The map does feature a village for players to visit, which is easy, but serviceable as a tutorial. Militia has a unfortunate introduction, but I suppose its dark nature fits with the dreary, dramatic post-war setting. The second part of the map is interesting in theory, teaching about terrain and making choke points to safely fight large groups of enemies, but ends up being a huge pain. Your Cavaliers have to dismount to cross the mountain alongside Marth, but this becomes extremely tedious as whoever crosses the mountain first has to get through a choke point with several fighters on the other side. Gordon and the sadly even weaker archer Ryan can provide some helpful chip at first, but as you push forward they get left behind. There are tons of thief reinforcements from the starting position that they can help kill, but I found those thieves to be a weird section of the map since they serve no purpose on the map other than providing something to do for units stuck on the right side. I did my best to get Luke as much XP as possible from the early thieves and some of the fighters across the map, but unfortunately his first level was unrewarding. At least Gordon got speed. After finally crossing the mountain, Marth gets to talk to the boss, sparking some relevant dialogue, then sees. I think Mystery of the Emblem had a decent introduction, but this is heavily carried by its greater focus on narrative, nicer looking characters, and better controls. I was not particularly inspired by how it showed off the classic Fire Emblem mechanics, and it was an odd introduction to the new dismounting mechanic. I'm looking forward to seeing where the story goes though, and hopefully the future maps are a bit more interesting. Next up is Genealogy of the Holy War, released in 1996, and first impressions of this game are great. The opening cinematic feels dramatic and sets up some lore, and the chapter starts with some narration about the world's nations, aided by visuals of the map and portraits of characters that show up later. Even before the battle, Sigurd gets some dialogue with the starting crew, both establishing the narrative conflict while explaining objectives of the map. Sigurd has to seize many castles, villages need to be saved before brigands burn them down, and the home castle needs to be protected. This dialogue also establishes the characters of the starting units, rather than just giving them to you, without context like previous games. The larger scale of Genealogy maps is also immediately noticeable, but the prologue plays out very cleanly and can be played in one satisfying sitting, helping new and old players alike get adjusted. Mechanically, this was the first game so far that genuinely felt enjoyable. There's calculated combat, clean controls, achievable but somewhat challenging side objectives, and battle forecasts compressed into one screen. Sigurd can one-run the low-leveled fighters, demonstrating his dominance over Genealogy immediately. Funneling all the resources into Sigurd may be the suggested way to quickly get through the game, but if you want to play as intended and train other units, Noish and Alec immediately show how units can team up for kills. In doing so, they also lead the player to look at the game's skills, since Alec doubles with Pursuit while Noish doesn't double, but may proc charge or critical. After taking a detour to get the first village, I have Noish set up kills for Alec against the first string of fighters. After a few turns, the map gives you two waves of new units, Quan, Ethlin, and Finn near the castle, and Lex and Azul in the north. Quan's group serves as a much-needed force to help Sigurd quickly break through the group guarding the first castle, while still getting kills to the trainees like Alec. Unfortunately, Quan doesn't set up kills for his wife Ethlin, but he does let Finn get kills, who otherwise has a relatively poor performance against all the axe users on the map. I give him the Speedring village, since I have the foreknowledge of the lack of free trading in Genealogy, and it vastly improves its performance in the next map. Meanwhile, in the north, Azel can one round the brigands burning down the nearby villages, and Lex has the movement to quickly get to villages that are far away. I have Lex stick around to visit the nearby villages so that Azel can keep moving forward and getting kills for himself, but he eventually finds his way to the northwest village. Sigurd actually has a good matchup against the first boss, having good hit and almost 2-rounding. This may not be representative of future boss fights, but it demonstrates how you use the Besiege command to attack enemies on forts, opening up the Seize command once they are defeated. Unfortunately, this is where a major critique of Genealogy shows up. Once you seize a castle, a large amount of reinforcements show up around the next castle, and it is usually optimal to wait to seize until your army is properly positioned to handle them. Ahead of time, I sent all my units to the choke point by the next castle, but Quandus barely didn't reach, so when I seized, a ton of fighters spawned and were able to team up against him for the kill. Thankfully, this game lets you save at the start of each turn, so it didn't take too long to go back and just wait another turn before seizing. Upon doing so, you also get Midir, who doesn't do anything particularly useful in the prologue, but can at least keep up with Sigurd and maybe get some kills against the fighters if you want. Upon making a safe choke point with Alec in the front, I focused on giving him and Azel as many kills as possible, with the other cavaliers speeding up the process using hit-and-run tactics, thanks to this game's amazing Canto. While this conceptually is similar to Mystery of the Emblem's choke point at the mountain, Genealogy actually lets you use everyone, Canto lets you get many attacks in while keeping the choke point, and you could get through it very quickly if you just left Sigurd to sweep them all. After pushing through, I finally have the opportunity to let Sigurd talk to Arvis, a green unit with ominously high stats and narrative importance, earning him the Silver Sword just before the final seize. Continuing off of Genealogy, we have Thracia 776, released in 1996. Like Mystery of the Emblem, this game plays off of the story of the previous title. Replaying the beginning of the game though, I think it stands on its own more. The opening cinematic gives a dramatic recap of an important moment from Genealogy, which on its own is enough to set the scene for the story. It features Leif, a character that comes later on in Genealogy, aided by a matured Finn, who we've already seen. The story also references some characters and story moments from Genealogy, but the first chapter demonstrates that this game will mostly be comprised of a unique cast with a story that can be understood on its own. The cast immediately gets a chance to show off their personalities and relationships with each other, with Abel's connection with Leif standing out. Additionally, I noticed the game didn't give any mythological lore, setting a more natural tone, complemented by a less saturated color palette. I must say that the colors are a bit drab though, so while some people might enjoy the more gritty setting, I personally find it a little unenticing. Mechanically, the game also stands out from Genealogy, but in interesting ways. Right away, the characters reference capturing, in which you can weaken your combat in order to rescue an enemy, take their items, and release them. Once you figure out the loop of capture, take, trade, and release, this becomes a very satisfying and powerful tool to accumulate resources in a game that is otherwise stingy with the amount of items you can get. The first map is a solid opportunity to try out not just the basic Fire Emblem mechanics, but also capturing, as the enemies are weak and fairly easy to capture, and you're even incentivized to get some basic lances for Finn to use if you want to save on the Brave Lance, since it's overkill and doesn't set up for kills for other units. There's also the usual villages to visit, and while they're not particularly inspiring, they at least ensure players will understand how and why to interact with them. As great as all this sounds, I have to admit that I only had such a clean time with the introduction due to foreknowledge. The game has a reputation for not being very beginner-friendly, and that sort of shows already with the conveyance of capturing. While the characters do reference it in concept, you have to figure out the whole loop on your own, and it is confusing just how much the capture command worsens your combat, making captures very inconsistent to set up. Also, like in Mystery of the Emblem, Thracia restricts weapon types for mountain units, but doesn't teach you about dismounting. This isn't too important in this map, but it'll be very relevant very soon. Hilariously though, a village does explicitly direct you towards the use command for vulneraries. Thanks, that's definitely the most important information you could have conveyed to the player. But yeah, if you're willing to use a guide to learn the niche mechanics and map layouts of the game, I think that Chapter 1 sets up for a relatively smooth and engaging strategic experience. As for my run, I started off by sending Ajin to the village where he gets his amazing personal weapon. While this takes him away from all the combat, I didn't want to relive my first playthrough where I had to send him all the way back once I realized only Ajin could visit. This left Halvin to get a fair amount of kills, who I wasn't intending to use, but I might try out now that he's already gotten some investment. I tried to have Halvin get captures where possible, but Finn had to help out in the end. After getting a javelin, Finn could set up kills for Halvin and Leaf. A few turns later, and Dagdar, Tanya, and Marty show up. They're a little far behind, but I'm playing slow enough that Dagdar ended up being useful for a few captures, and Marty was great at setting up for Leaf kills. I have absolutely no interest in Tanya, though, so I didn't give her much to do. By holding all my units back to set up for kills for Leaf, Halvin, and even one for Ajin at the end, I delayed the siege for several turns. This was a bit unsatisfying, and perhaps reflective of the uncalculated nature of the map, compared to say FE1 or Genealogy. In the end though, I think it was serviceable for a tutorial for the basic mechanics, while the unique mechanics make it a bit more interesting, if you know how to use them. Moving on to the GBA games, we have Binding Blade, released in 2002. Like with the SNES, the transition to a new console is immediately appreciated, arguably even more so considering how loved the style is by the Fire Emblem community today. I did find that the cutscene art doesn't really hold out as outstanding, but I do think the map environment elements, character portraits, and animations are all very charming. Presentation aside, I think Binding Blade kind of rushes past its introductory scenes, but is serviceable in setting up the nations and general conflict. What really got me hooked was the gameplay, starting with the first map. You know, Binding Blade's first map, Tutorial. That's right, Binding Blade actually contains a separate tutorial map, which is completely disconnected from the main game and gives the player a very explicit lesson on every main mechanic. While the experienced players don't need it at all, I think it could be useful for completely new players, while still being a fun experience. It has its own introductory narration, making it almost feel like a complete chapter, and features a handful of characters in the main game. Hilariously, Cecilia is the character that teaches you, laying out how to move, what each command does, the importance of visiting villages, and seizing. Wolt and Lilina each pop in, showing off how to team up for kills and how to utilize attack ranges, though sadly, Wolt is irrelevant even here, as Roy can already one-run the enemy he starts by, and Wolt does 0 damage to the boss. Speaking of, the boss is Boars, who actually is tough for Roy to beat, and you need Lilina to chip him down over a couple turns. As a side note, Cecilia tells you how to use the rescue command, and you can technically use it to win a turn earlier, but you don't actually need it to complete the map. This results in a kind of underwhelming introduction to the rescue drop system, which is actually a big part of the GBA games. Moving on to the actual first chapter, I think this is another reasonable first map for giving an opportunity to learn game mechanics. On normal mode, which is the only mode unlocked at first, you are under a lot of pressure, and I would honestly compare it pretty closely to Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light, with a cast that performs pretty similarly, just with an underwhelming knight instead of a flying trainee. I'll be playing on hard mode though, and as such, it was a pretty rough map. I've only played Binding Blade once in normal mode, and I was caught off guard by the sheer strength of the generic fighters and archers. I was stubborn in not letting Marcus get any kills, which made it harder, but I was thankfully able to push past the choke point I set up in the beginning in time to save the village. The rest of the map was much smoother, with Alan being able to take a forest in the middle, and the Cavaliers finishing off the enemies at the end. I made sure to get Roy and Wolt some kills throughout the process, especially since I know that they fall off really hard and really fast. In an attempt to save turns, I just took the L and let Marcus get the boss kill, and finally seized with Roy. Chapter 1 ended up being a pretty tight experience in the hard mode, but I know that on normal mode, which all players in need of learning mechanics were forced to play, the map is a fine area to figure out movement, combat, terrain, villages, and seizing. Like the tutorial though, there isn't much that shows off Rescue Drop, or even anything that references it. Considering that this is one of the GBA game's main drawing points, I find this a little disappointing. Chapter 1 still serves as a perfectly fine introduction though, with the tutorial being a cute map that allows for complete beginners to learn the game, while not forcing experienced players to play it. Next in the GBA lineup is Blazing Blade from 2003, which, like Mystery and Thracia, plays off the previous title. This time though, the game is a complete prequel, and while it contains references to its predecessor, it also stands on its own fairly well. Blazing Blade is interesting because, in addition to a normal and hard difficulty, the game features 3 different lords, each with their own route. Lyn mode is shorter at 10 chapters, and its fairly easy maps have been said to serve as a tutorial for new players, perhaps due to it being the first Fire Emblem game officially released in North America. Upon defeating Lyn mode, you unlock Eliwood mode, which is the main campaign. After beating Eliwood mode, you can then play Hector mode, which functionally is similar to Eliwood's, but adds a couple chapters and makes the maps more challenging. I believe the story is slightly different, but the main draw is the more intense gameplay. I have completed Lyn and Eliwood mode once on normal, but for this playthrough I'll play Hector hard mode. Unfortunately, this mode alone is very long, so I'll be skipping Lyn mode. This means we won't get to directly look at the actual tutorial maps, and some units will end up worse without the extra training, but I still think Hector's early maps should do a good job at easing the player into the challenges of the mode, and I trust the game is still beatable, even without units like Sane and Florina having a few extra levels. Getting into the gameplay, Blazing Blade sees the first avatar character, technically. The Technician isn't an actual unit, but it gives the game an opportunity to directly speak to the player using their name, either female or male pronouns, as well as a birthday, which is used to determine which units get a very slight boost to their combat. I've named the avatar for our run Queen, and chosen a November birthday in order to support Raven, my favorite Blazing Blade unit. Humorously, this will have consequences in future games, but for now, it is technically useful. The first map of Hector mode is interesting. At a first glance, it seems like a cool map that shows off the powers of the Thief class, and sneaking around with Matthew while opening doors and stealing items would be a good time. Unfortunately, the actual combat of the map is centered around the only other deployed character, Hector. His damage is actually solid, but the lack of initial healing means you have to rush for the droppable vulneraries before he gets overwhelmed, and his accuracy is frustratingly low. On my first attempt, I do the correct play and send Hector to the left to get the archer's vulnerary, but between the soldiers getting good stats, Hector missing the archers, and not baiting the knight with the second vulnerary, I immediately get a game over. Thankfully, the second attempt goes much better. Hector is able to one-round the soldiers, he nails all his hits on the archers, and I remember to bait the knight right away to get enough healing. He also got amazing level ups, which I hope makes the next couple of rough chapters a bit better. After fighting the main group in the middle of the map, I take way longer than I need setting up safe steals for Matthew, in addition to having him steal the enemy thief's lockpick a couple times for free XP. A long time later, and after Matthew risks a 2% crit for the boss's vulnerary, Hector gets the kill for the win. Despite the second run going so well, the first attempt made me consider that this map is actually pretty rough. It does make the player utilize thief mechanics, and getting to see Hector be a strong frontlining lord is cool, but the strategy of the map isn't incredibly involved, so as a first map I don't think it's the best. Admittedly, players can only play Hector mode after beating Lyn and Eliwood mode, but I think that Hector mode should still be able to stand as its own clean experience. Conceptually a cool start, but in practice I didn't really feel it delivered. As an interesting contrast to Blazing Blade's Hector hard mode, we now move on to the Sacred Stones, released in 2004. This title is known for its easy gameplay, and I've heard arguments both against and in favor of its story. Personally, I think the opening was effective at getting the player interested in the story. The opening cutscene is a bit bland with its introduction of the humans versus monsters conflict, but the world map is about on par with Binding Blade, and there's immediately some good tension with Erica running away from the castle with Seth, supported by some cutscenes that utilize the map and combat animations. Getting into the prologue, the map is admittedly a bit underwhelming, but I honestly think that similar to many of the other games, it's serviceable in teaching basic mechanics. I believe that on the easier modes, the game forces certain actions upon the player, with tutorial narration in a similar fashion to Binding Blade's tutorial, although without the narrative flair that Binding Blade included. I will be playing on the highest difficulty, aptly named Difficult, which removes these restrictions and lets players act as they see fit. Unlike Binding Blade's hard mode and Blazing Blade's Hector mode though, Difficult can be played whenever, and considering that it still has an ironically low amount of difficulty, I believe that it should still have a good opening that can teach new players how to get into the game, even more so than the previous titles. The prologue does this just fine, being very straightforward and giving the player an opportunity to figure out movement, combat, and terrain. I mean, there really isn't any strategy to put together, but I think it's funny that the fast strategy for experienced players to mess around with involves having to get lucky with Erica dodge tanking. Of course, you could just have Seth kill everything, which is representative of the rest of Sacred Stones, but if you're not playing a strict LTC and caring about, having fun, You might as well have Erica face off against the first enemies in the game. As another contrast to Blazing Blade, Sacred Stones is a pretty short game. As such, while the prologue is not meant to serve as the only tutorial map, it is all I will be covering in this part. Overall, I actually appreciate it as a short map that directs players towards the basic mechanics, while not holding their hand and forcing them through their first actions if you're at least a bit experienced and playing difficult. I promise that future maps will be a bit more interesting though, especially when you hold Seth back in order to have fun training more of the early game units. Next up is Path of Radiance, made for the GameCube in 2005. The jump to 3D modeling and animation makes it stand out a lot from the other games, so even though the quality isn't the best by modern standards, I think it still looks super impressive when compared to the older games. Other than the visual style, the content of the opening cinematic is also super exciting, giving players hints at several characters and unique fantasy elements, such as the Lagoos, rather than simply setting up a dichotomy of humans versus dragons or humans versus monsters. The actual first scenes featuring Ike are relatively grounded though, which both helps players relate to the protagonist, while also making you curious how the story will play out to include all the cool elements from the opening cinematic. While the opening is cool, you still get to the start of the prologue pretty quickly. The map is honestly pretty similar to Binding Blade's tutorial, in which you are guided to make specific actions with other characters giving narration. On lower difficulty modes, I believe there is forced, more explicit dialogue explaining how to input the specific actions. I'll be playing on the highest difficulty for the English release, once again named Difficult. As such, I was able to get through the map pretty quickly. Ike runs up and fights Boyd over a couple of combats, then Grail shows up and you use a Vulnerary before taking him out over a few combats as well. It's a pretty concise explanation of movement, combat, and item usage, and while I would say it's a little too simplistic for even slightly experienced players, the narrative flair of sparring against your teammates makes up for it. Before moving on to Chapter 1, there's a couple short scenes that introduce more characters, including the new recruits Titania and Oscar. In my mind, the scene goes further than the other games by establishing stronger connections between the characters within the introductory dialogue, and it's fun seeing this cute little mercenary crew acting casually and living their normal life. Chapter 1 is also a bit like Binding Blade's Chapter 1, teaching the player to visit villages before they get burned down by brigands and seize with the Lord, while also giving a few generic enemies to test out fighting with a more complete army. The characters directly reference not having Ike run forward on his own, or else he'll die, and you can instead make a wall with your units so that all the enemies have an attack target but can't kill anyone. A key element of Path of Radiance's spin on the first chapter, however, is that it actually has low stakes, with all your units being able to take a couple of hits if they need to. The Jagan-like character is also incredibly strong, and more like Seth, in that you could have her kill all the enemies, but while the enemies are weak, you might as well take the extra turn or two to give kills to other units. I take this opportunity to give several kills to Ike, while Boyd gets the village. I do let Titania get the boss kill, so it saves several turns, and also gives her a decent amount of XP. Overall, a clean map. I left the battle animations on the first map, and since it was so short, I actually appreciated them. Going forward, I will turn them off though, as they do take a noticeably long time and make the gameplay a bit frustrating. Another thought I had while playing was that there was never really an introduction to two big mechanics, Rescue Drop and Shove. Like in the GBA games, you basically have to figure out what the rescue command does on your own, and there isn't an obvious use for it from the start. You might be encouraged to use the shove mechanic to get Ike to the seize point faster in Chapter 1, and Boyd does have special dialogue if you shove him in the prologue, but the game doesn't allude to its usage. Just feels like a bit of a missed opportunity, since it's such an iconic feature of the Tellius games. Following Path of Radiance is Radiant Dawn, released in 2007 for the Wii. This is the third title in the series that plays off of the previous one, being a sequel akin to Mystery of the Emblem. Narratively, the game is also similar, in seeing the drama of a post-war setting. I found the presentation of Radiant Dawn to be immediately captivating though, having an epic and dramatic opening cinematic that functions more like a trailer. Having the context of Path of Radiance makes it more exciting, as you see characters you know and love engaging in epic battles, but it is also pretty action-packed and still interesting for new players. The game is definitely anticipating that players will have completed Path of Radiance though, as if you transfer your data from that game, you can get special bonuses, such as stats for highly used characters, extra scenes, and even a couple of new units. They do make for a fuller experience of Radiant Dawn, but I believe the base game should stand on its own, so I'll be playing without transfers or a second save file. I've only ever played the game once, so I'll be playing on normal mode, since in my opinion, the way that hard mode conceals enemy ranges and makes a lot of units have poor performance by reducing XP gain, would make for an experience that's more frustrating than fun. The prologue is off to a great start, with the cutscene featuring the new characters. Micaiah gets a show off her light magic, standing out from the long line of sword-wielding lords in the previous games, and South gets an edgy, flashy introduction as a thief, not unlike Matthew in the Blazing Blade. Afterwards, we get to see some cute interactions with the other members of the Dawn Brigade, and then we get swept away into the first map. The transition from cutscene to gameplay was pretty smooth in my opinion, which helps the vibes of the map. It's pretty straightforward, with Edward frontlining all the brigands, and Micaiah either getting some kills for herself, or healing Edward with her unique healing mechanic, Sacrifice. Leonardo technically makes an appearance, but late enough to only help chip down the boss. I give most of the kills to Micaiah, since I'm more confident in Edward's ability to gain XP on his own in the next few maps. After some tense scenes of the Dawn Brigade running through the city and evading capture, we get thrown into a map, yet again with a pretty smooth transition. The tense vibes continue as the victory condition is escape. This is pretty exciting, as we already get to experiment with more interesting strategies and incentives from Chapter 1. I have Nolan and Edward frontline, with Nolan being Jigen-like in his ability to set up kills for Edward and Micaiah. Leonardo got left behind to visit the village, but he is still able to provide some meaningful chip damage later on. I take a couple extra turns at the choke points to ensure Micaiah continues to get kills, but at the end, I was still able to squeeze out the boss kill between 3 units to get the steel sword. The first map's simplistic nature and lower stakes makes for a good space to figure out movement, combat, and healing, like other games. The second map teaches the player about villages, which is also standard. I think both maps stand out though by being actually kind of interesting if you already know how to play the game, as you figure out how to best utilize the choke points to move as fast as possible while also staying safe. Newer players can take a couple extra turns in case they make a mistake or want to be extra cautious, and the map won't punish them, which is great. The player does have to figure out the mechanics mostly on their own without a lot of narration, but I think these maps allow for the mechanics to be self-explanatory. Unfortunately, there's still not a great introduction to the more unique mechanics of rescue, drop, and shove, but to be fair, having such a fair lord might encourage the player to use rescue or shove on Micaiah whenever she's in danger, and I could see someone using shove to cope with the time nature of the escape map. Moving on to the DS games now, we have Shadow Dragon, a remake of the first game in the series, released in 2008. From my understanding, the maps, enemy stats, and player units in normal mode are largely the same. If you do play in normal mode though, there are some added prologue maps that are more explicit tutorials which also have a complete narrative, somewhat similar to Blazing Blade's Lin mode. Past normal, there are many levels of hard mode to choose from, which I believe is mostly used to ramp up the enemy stats and quantity higher and higher. Regardless of which hard mode you choose from though, you skip past the added prologue maps and start right away in Chapter 1. I will be playing in Hard 1 in order to get an experience representative of the remake, while still being manageable on the blind playthrough. Unfortunately, even Hard 1 made a significant difference in how I view Chapter 1. The resources you have are largely the same, except Shadow Dragon has Sheeta using lances rather than swords. To be fair, the more modern graphics and the addition of a short opening cutscene made the game more appealing to look at, and the controls were a lot more manageable than FE1. However, the pirates being even a little stronger kind of ruined the map's role as a tutorial. While normal mode may have explicit instructions for how to play, Hard 1 is only one step up and should allow for a clean first experience for all players to get adjusted to the game. With the boost in speed, the pirates no longer get doubled by anyone, meaning 3 units have to team up for a singular kill, of which there are more to get. Because one of the cavaliers has to take an extra hit during this process, there's more damage going around, but yet you still don't get access to healing outside of the tedious and slow-acting forts until the end of the map. The cool moment of fending off pirates in the north is also less epic, since there's weirdly only 2 there, and the map is already encouraging you to keep your army huddled together. The ending also sucks, since the boss is absurdly stronger, and even Jagged can barely do consistent damage. From what I've heard of Shadow Dragon, the experience of using several attacks to get rid of just one generic enemy and having impossible to beat bosses is representative of the game, but just because it's consistent doesn't mean it makes for a good introductory map. Knowing that the game would be more difficult, I mostly gave up on feeding kills to the weak Archer Gordon and focused more on Sheeta, whose personal effective weapon I know to be a critical tool in the future. I had to spread XP between Cain and Abel more evenly though, in an attempt to clear out the enemies faster. At least Jagen didn't crit and steal a kill this run, and the higher enemy stats means he will never accidentally one-run enemies. I'm looking forward to some of the added mechanics such as supports and reclassing, and to be fair, the bulk of the map wasn't actually too challenging, but this first map does have me concerned with how enjoyable the gameplay will be as maps get bigger and units struggle to keep up with the enemy stats. On the other end, we have New Mystery of the Emblem, a remake of the third title, released in 2010. While I felt FE1 had a solid opening, but FE3 was a bit underwhelming, I actually enjoy New Mystery's beginning a whole lot more than Shadow Dragons. This is in part due to the fact that New Mystery forces all players to play its original prologue maps, regardless of difficulty. The game still starts with a recap of Shadow Dragon's story, but I felt the usage of a map with graphics to demonstrate territories and army movement made it more memorable and useful, which is nice for new players who haven't fully played Shadow Dragon like myself. Admittedly, I don't love the visual style of these two games, but I appreciate the upgrade regardless, and find it was easier to make a connection with the characters. Speaking of the characters, I really enjoyed how New Mystery's prologue maps give a more in-depth introduction to the main characters. They start off in military training, but still have casual interactions, much like the first Path of Radiance scenes. I do feel the scenes focus on Luke a little more than the other characters, but I like him, so I'm okay with that. Of course, I must acknowledge New Mystery's infamous Avatar character. I don't know exactly what people don't like about them, but based on their presentation in the opening cinematic as that person who helped Marth in the shadows, I would imagine that their presence in the main game is thought to be forced or obtrusive. Gameplay-wise, they also might be really good and invalidate the usage of the beloved characters from the original. From what I saw in the prologue though, I really like how they were incorporated. Like in Blazing Blade, you choose a name in a male or female form that dictates how the characters refer to you, but you also get to make a meaningful impact on the game as a playable, somewhat customizable unit. They also have their own personality, and since I kept a similar design to the default avatar, I felt they blended in as a new character and not a self-insert. I have no idea what the personality quiz does, but choosing a class was tangible and seemed relevant from the start. I chose Queen's class to be a mage, though it was a little disappointing that the classes are gender-locked, and you only get a few choices after choosing your form. The prologue actually contains 8 maps, and while the first are very small, I figured I would cover 4 in this part and finish the other 4 in the next. When I say the maps are small, I mean so small that there are only a couple enemies, but yet you can't move your units out of their range. I can tell these maps are meant to give very specific tutorials, which the characters reference before and during the map. Prologue 1 lets you get comfortable with movement, combat, and using items, in which you crush the basic soldier, then handle the slightly stronger Jagan. Unfortunately, the higher stats of Hard 1 is already noticeable, since I have to use 2 vulneraries to safely defeat Jagan, and the weakest soldier in the game doesn't even get one-rounded. The map is still a fun way to see how the Avatar's chosen class plays out though, and is fairly low stakes, even on Hard 1. A quick but solid start. Prologue 2 is definitely tougher, with Queen and Ryan just barely teaming up to kill Roderick and Luke. This map is meant to teach the player to team up for kills, and not just recklessly send one unit forward. Humorously, this map kind of teaches the player the power of turtling, in which you group up all your units, bait enemies one at a time, and destroy them on player phase. I kind of view this as a cheese strategy, to be utilized by new players who want to be extra cautious, but some maps don't allow for fighting several enemies in one enemy phase, considering the imbalance of stats between player and enemy units, and the early game of New Mystery seems to be one such game. So, in a roundabout way, Prologue 2 is effective at teaching players a useful strategy. I found Prologue 3 to be much more stressful, and perhaps a victim of Hard 1's increased stats. On normal, I imagine it functions as a low-stakes map to give the player an opportunity to see Weapon Triangle in action, with there being sword and axe enemies to fight with your new lance and sword users. Unfortunately, they start right on top of you, and because the map is tiny, you can't actually turtle like you could in the previous map. I got a lucky crit with Luke on the first enemy phase though, so I didn't have any pressure turn 2. The map then lets you see weapon effectivity at play, with Ryan shooting down Cheetah, which I imagine is peak combat for Ryan throughout the whole game. Lastly is Prologue 4, which has you fighting in the constrained terrain of a building rather than an open field, and therefore teaching how to utilize choke points and make use of 2-range weapons. Unfortunately, the enemies are pretty strong on Hard 1, and I make a misplay with my positioning turn 1, getting Roderick killed and leading to my first reset of the game. The second attempt, I probably make the 2-tile choke point by actually killing one soldier on player phase, thanks to Queen and Ryan's 2-range. Roderick and Luke have a tough time fending off the archer and the insanely strong Athena, but by taking care with my healing, trading of items, and usage of 2-range attacks, I'm able to win without another reset. I will say that Queen is getting pretty low on fire uses, and I'm worried that she won't get another one until after the prologue. Hopefully Prologue 5 gives a tutorial on how to purchase weapons from the armory. First of what I personally consider the modern Fire Emblem games is Awakening, released in 2012 for the 3DS. The game was very popular at release, and I understand that it was many players' first Fire Emblem game, myself included. Just from me playing up through the prologue, I can see why. The art style is cleaner and more M&A reminiscent. Characters such as Chrom and Lissa are specifically designed to be charming, and the gameplay is flashy but easy to pick up. The premonition cutscene is also a particularly strong hook, showing a dramatic moment near the end of the game while concealing the context, making the player wonder how the story leads there. Like Path of Radiance, the actual start to the story is fairly grounded and has a quaint vibe, with the Lord Chrom leading the shepherds across the country, camping out in the woods and helping villages in need. I'll admit the initial conflict isn't too interesting, but again, knowing that the story will eventually lead up to Chrom getting stabbed with lightning, and the presence of a scary dragon creature maintains a level of intrigue. Awakening also continues the incorporation of a playable avatar character, which from now on will be a mainstay in all new games. This game's avatar is known to be very powerful, having access to every class without needing to stick to one, and has access to some unique tools that makes them stand out from the rest of the cast. Unlike New Mystery, this is an original game, so the avatar doesn't necessarily stand out as weird, especially considering that they have an established and fairly liked character. There are more options for the design customization, and although you don't get to choose a class, you do get to more explicitly determine variation in their stats. To stay on theme with Queen being a mage, I chose the magic asset and strength flaw. The gameplay actually starts with the premonition, which is even earlier than its prologue. This map is more comparable to Sacred Stone's or Path of Radiance's prologues, in which you're given a very simple map that teaches you to move units and attack. Rather than highlighting other elements like terrain or items, this map technically shows off the duel system, in which units can be supported by an adjacent or paired up unit, and there's a chance that the support unit triggers an attack of their own. If Chrom or Queen do trigger a dual strike, you can win a turn early, but I was surprised to see in this run that the developers did not rig this, and you might just not get a dual strike. This not only loses a turn, but also means that new players might not even see the new mechanics right away, making the map a little pointless. It does flow well into the cutscene though, so it's mostly harmless. The actual prologue map plays more like a Chapter 1, in which you get a full cast of units from the start and have several enemies to fight across the map. While the premonition restricted the player from pairing up, this map lets you see its power in its fullest. On the infamous Lunatic mode, you basically have to have the Jigen-like Frederick carry most of the early game on his own, but on hard mode you can have him pair up with Chrom or the Avatar, which lets them tank the enemies incredibly well and have a chance to obliterate them with a dual strike. I will be playing on hard mode, since Lunatic is a very polarizing game mode, and I don't have enough experience to get through it while not relying on classic, boring options. Thanks to this reasonable difficulty, I was safe to pair up Frederick with Queen, since she can make use of Veteran to get boosted XP while paired up. I normally have the Avatar and Chrom get an even amount of kills while teaming up together, and I was honestly planning on doing the same this run. Once I gave Frederick to Queen for the defense though, they basically just killed everything themselves, which just goes to show how powerful pair-up is in Awakening. So far, Awakening has been pretty harmless, despite some previous bad experiences I've had with the game. I was honestly surprised, and I at least hope that the rest of the early game keeps up with the good pace set by the opening. The next three games are different versions of Fire Emblem Fates, released in 2015. The grouping consists of two separate routes, Birthright and Conquest, and the third route of Revelation, which can be purchased through a copy of either one. I will be playing all three routes, utilizing the Branch of Fate mechanic to branch off of one save file after the first 5 tutorial maps. These maps occur independent of your difficulty mode, so even though I will be playing on Lunatic, we'll still get to see them. As we will see, they will also be very important in laying a strong foundation for the early game of each route. Before getting into the gameplay, I think Fates gives a strong first impression. The slow motion battles and wispy art style featuring the main characters in the opening cinematic is very dramatic, and setting aside the repetitive nature of Azura's song within the game, it certainly is intriguing on the first listen. The art style of the environments and character portraits also make it look even better than Awakening, at least to me. While Fate's avatar character is certainly controversial, I think their incorporation in the gameplay, and even their contributions to the narrative of these first few chapters, is solid, and gives the player a personal connection to the world. Like New Mystery, you have to choose just one class to use, but like Awakening, they have a unique class that they start out in, and can use a resource to reclass later. You can re-choose when starting a run from the Branch of Fate, but to stay on theme, I chose the Mage Talent, a Magic Boon, and a Strength Bane. Unlike Awakening though, the Strength Bane will actually be somewhat relevant, even as early as Chapter 1. The game throws you right into a conflict, in which you can see many units from both sides of the main cast on the map, as well as some of the Hoshidan royals fighting alongside you. The actual gameplay of the prologue is a very explicit tutorial, with characters and pop-up tutorials telling you what to do. On higher difficulties, the tutorials don't show up though, and you have to figure out the information for yourself in the extensive guide. Regardless, players should be able to figure out how to move, initiate combat, and see how the new dual strikes work. You also see that some units can heal others, and that there is an uncontrollable but allied green army. Other than that though, the map abruptly ends and you dream the entire scene. A little lame, but it certainly functions as a way to get a glimpse of the other characters, and the basic nature of the map is paired with dialogue from relevant characters, so I don't think it's terrible. The random ending and fabricated nature of the scene does make it stand out as a bit of an awkward start though. Chapter 1 is honestly about the same, though conceptually more satisfying with only one enemy to take care of and a definitive goal. Xander teaches you movement and attacking, again, but also suggests that enemies won't attack you on enemy phase, which is obviously not true. If he did, then you would die after attacking into him, I know, but the game could have just given Xander less attack or something. He also shows off the new Dragon Vein mechanic, and how terrain can be altered mid-map. Since the player doesn't actually control it though, it feels a bit random. After taking a turn to heal, the player can safely attack Xander again, and safely win with a third strike. Oh, unless you have a Strength Bane. With a drop in Queen's base strength, she actually needs 4 attacks, and therefore another turn healing. Already behind LTC pace, unfortunately. The map is underwhelming, and honestly doesn't even teach much, but it's well incorporated into a scene that features the Norian characters of Conquest having a fun, if not a bit cringy dialogue, that establishes their characters. So again, it's serviceable. Lastly, we move on to Chapter 2, which feels like the first real battle. You can now control 2 additional units, and there is an actually somewhat interesting map to mess around with the new mechanics, with the new characters giving advice along the way. Admittedly, the tutorial dialogue does pop up a lot, and make it difficult to skip past for an experienced player, but even then, the map can be actually kind of challenging and requires some time. This is especially true if trying to avoid giving kills to the Jagan-like Gunter, as I force myself to do. After several attempts of messing around, I finally figured out a decent way to do so. Queen of course triggered the Dragon Vein to set up the fort in the middle with choke points and healing tiles. She then took the left choke point turn 2, leaving the Samurai alive and encouraging Rinka to move right, since I left the right choke point open. Using Gunter's dual strikes, Queen could one-shot the Samurai on the right, while Jacob could use Corrin's dual strike to finish off the Oni Savage on the left. With this positioning and continued use of dual strikes, I was able to stay safe from Kaze and Rinka, and still found out all the kills of Queen and Jacob, but with the Strength Bane, Gunter had to be involved in more dual strikes than he normally would. Still, it's always a personal victory for me to avoid giving kills to Jagans while maintaining a low turn count. As you can tell from my breakdown of Chapter 2, I think it's pretty great, showing off how you can use Dragon Veins, dual strikes, debuffs from daggers, the power of 1-2 range weapons, and healing all of your own accord. On lower difficulty modes, I imagine it's not so tight, meaning you don't have to make perfect use of all of them, but enemy dual strikes and Claus's debuffs still make for a challenging experience that is representative of the Fates games. While I think a prologue map to give an idea on basic mechanics was fair, I'm not sure that 2 were necessary, nor were these particularly inspiring. Chapter 2 sets a good pace for the rest of the game though, and it makes me excited to play more. As the last remake of the Marathon, we have Echoes, Shadows of Valentia, a remake of Gaiden released in 2017. Mechanically, Shadows of Valentia is extremely similar to Gaiden, only adding a few features such as supports, weapon forging, and a hard mode. Additionally, dungeons and villages were reworked, and a couple characters were added, one of which shows up right from the start. One of the main upgrades this game makes is the expanded story and improved presentation. The visual style and music are all very beloved by the Fire Emblem community, and do an amazing job of getting players invested with the world and characters, regardless of the gameplay. While the gameplay isn't bad per se, there are a few elements and maps that can be discouraging to players, starting right away with the added prologue. Before getting to the prologue though, the opening cinematic about the 2 gods is expanded to include visuals, and a new scene is added that features Alm and the villagers as children. This is a little weird, but it does establish the close connections that they all have when grown up, and more precisely establishes Alm and Celica's motivation to find each other in the main game. Shadows of Valentia takes this childhood sequence to introduce the new 3D exploration, albeit not in an actual dungeon, but by having Alm run to Celica and feel the flowers in a straight line for all of 2 seconds. It's boring, and makes skipping to the real start of the game annoying, but like Fate's prologue, it's serviceable in showing off the existence of new mechanics. The other added aspect is the prologue map itself, which is an odd one. In concept, it is interesting in how it connects to the story, and gives an opportunity to see the importance of terrain. The villagers aren't in actually any danger outside of Alm though, who literally just has to move one space back, so it ends up feeling like a tutorial for just how to move and initiate combat, seen through Mycen. It's fine, but as we saw in Gaiden, the first maps are actually good at teaching basic mechanics while also giving the player freedom and letting them feel smart for figuring it out on their own, so this map feels a bit unnecessary. After finally moving on from the very long prologue, we jump forward to Alm in present day, where Gaiden begins. Here we can see the upgraded villages, in which you fast travel between a few locations, can look around to pick up items, and get more characters to talk to. Lucas still makes you go back and forth between Alm's house and the village gate, so you get to practice moving around. Once you leave, Gray and Tobin automatically join, and you can choose to recruit Cliff and the new character Faye. It can be fun to leave them behind to be picked up later, but I go ahead and recruit both for the classic Shadows of Valentia experience. Ram Woods is a bit different now that Faye's here. She has similar combat to Cliff and is also level 1, so she gives you more incentive for Alm and Lucas to not just kill everything. It's a bit tricky to give them both all the kills, but by blocking the enemy's path to the heal tile, I was able to encourage the enemies to be aggressive, saving a turn while still getting some kills for the villagers. Fleecer's Forest also went in turn faster, as this time I just killed the pesky archer turn 1 with Alm and Lucas thanks to Alm's closer starting position. Despite Gray getting back-to-back crits on the right, Tobin still got enough levels to get promoted to the next part, with Faye and Cliff just needing another kill or two in the next battle. Overall, Faye's inclusion makes the earlier maps a little more tight, but the better controls and visuals made the maps more engaging and get you hooked to play more. I'm specifically excited for the next part though, as we'll get to choose promotions for the villagers, creating a unique, customizable cast for the early game. Moving on to the Switch games, we finally get to Three Houses, released in 2019. This is my most played game by far, and I'm excited to give my thoughts and hopefully demonstrate an interesting way of approaching the game. The first few chapters may not be all too different, but setting up for a team that can quickly play the late game maps upright should make the playthrough stand out from the warp skip heavy approach that the community often mentions. Like Fates, this game features many routes, with 3 houses to choose from during Chapter 1. Additionally, the Black Eagle's house splits into 2 separate routes halfway through the game, making for 4 unique routes in total. While the player is expected to play all routes to fully experience all sides of the story, the first half of the game's chapters are the same no matter which house you pick, and many of the maps are infamously shared in the second half despite the route splits, so playing all 4 routes would take a ton of time for not much payoff. As a compromise, I will be playing through the early game just once, picking the Black Eagles, and once the route split has been initiated, I will use a backup save to branch the playthrough into both the Silver Snow and Crimson Flower routes. Crimson Flower may be shorter, but at least its maps are unique, so we'll be able to see both sides of the conflict while avoiding repetition. Back to the game's opening, the game is off to an amazing start with the opening cinematic. Hearing a remixed Edge of Dawn while getting clips of the future animated cutscenes is really exciting. The opening cutscene is also pretty great, showing a flashy battle that connects to the main game's lore. Not all routes actually address it, but it'll at least be relevant later on in the Crimson Flower route. Sophis also has an intriguing introduction, with some mystery lingering as to her identity and your connection to her. The scene also serves as a way to input information about the Avatar, which is admittedly a bit awkward, especially since the Avatar isn't voice acted like everyone else. Even though you can't change this Avatar's appearance, we'll still be naming her Queen. The only other information to input is the birthday. I'll be consistent with the November birthday I chose for Queen in Blazing Blade, which will have a small consequence. Because the game has its own calendar that progresses as you complete more chapters, I won't get the birthday bonus item until just before the time skip. It'll be irrelevant then, but having it for the early game would have made for a nice boost in consistency. Oh well. Despite these limitations on Avatar customization, I honestly feel that the prologue presents the Avatar as less of an established character than the previous games. Not having voice acting is a big part of this, but the prologue also shows off dialogue options, so the only time the Avatar talks is when you speak for them. The scene also shows how dialogue options can earn or even lose support points with other characters. This is nice for making the player feel they're more personally connected to the world and characters, but I'm not sure it's worth the loss of personality in the main character. After a quick introduction to the three house leaders, we get thrown into the prologue. The characters will have more time to establish themselves before you make a decision, but I do feel that their interactions here were less compelling than, say, Path of Radiance or Awakening's cast of roaming fighters having banter with each other. On the other hand, Three Houses Prologue does give a good map to establish how each of the characters functions as units. Dimitri and Edelgard are kind of similar, to be fair, but Cloud stands out as a bowlord. On lower difficulties, the map is like Binding Blade and Awakening, with a few different groups of enemies scattered across the map, letting the player naturally figure out the basic mechanics. I'll be playing on Maddening, which is known for its drastic increase in enemy stats, but honestly, they're relatively tame in the prologue, and the map is still reasonably beatable on the blind attempt. Regardless of difficulty mode, Geralt does interrupt every action with dialogue explaining the mechanic with a matching tutorial box that you have to click through, so there's still guidance that newer players are guaranteed to see. It is a little frustrating when replaying, however. I start off by treating Claude's bow to Queen, having her weaken the first enemy and give the kill to Edelgard while being adjacent to Queen, whose personal ability, Professor's Guidance, gives adjacent allies and herself a boost in XP gain. This is a level of optimization that will persist throughout most, if not all the game. The bonus experience is especially useful in the early game of Maddening in order to reach the levels needed for promoting at a quick pace. Having Queen attack instead of Claude shows another obnoxious optimization, that of getting as many combats in as possible, letting you gain more weapon experience and class mastery points. You don't need every kill to get the Professor's Guidance boost, and it's okay if all your units aren't attacking every turn, but if you can find a way to do so, you might as well, turning Three Houses' early game into one giant puzzle. In fairness of the prologue though, there is no immediate encouragement to play in such an intense manner. I think it's actually a good introduction, especially for combat arts, which are super useful for improving consistency on player phase. With the first optimization out of the way, I have Edelgard and Queen team up to fight the second group just fine, trading around the bow when necessary. I actually get a game over after rushing Edelgard to fight the next group, greedily getting a kill on player phase instead of healing her. Next time, I make sure to heal her, and the rest goes smoothly. Geralt does start moving with boss group, and gets a kill against the thief that got hurt on enemy phase. Normally, this would be very unsatisfying, but since the victory condition is defeat boss and there are only 2 units that care about getting kills, Edelgard and Queen are each able to get a kill on the final turn regardless. Last up is Fire Emblem Engage, released in 2023. As a reference-heavy game, I'm excited to play this game in sequence with the previous titles, and see how the emblem characters and parallel maps compare to how I experienced them in their original games. To encourage the connection of Engage and the other playthroughs, I will be giving the emblems to characters that are reminiscent of the emblem's paired ending or S support partner in the original game, utilizing this game's reclassing system to strengthen the connection. For example, I will be giving Marth to Chloe, an early game Pegasus Knight with blue hair like Sheeta, and I will give Micaiah the clan in the Thief class, as a green protagonist simp like Soph. Going into the game's opening, I think it has a deceivingly exciting start. The opening cinematic is flashy and features a hype song while showing off some of the new characters. The opening cutscene is also intriguing, showing a dramatic battle between the characters featured in the opening cinematic, fighting alongside some of the lords of the previous game, such as Lyn and Ike. The Avatar and Emblem Marth share some dramatic dialogue that makes the player wonder about the context, and how the player will end up in the situation. This is great, but having played the game before, I'm a little more critical. The flashy nature of the cutscenes conceals that they don't actually hint at much of anything substantial, other than a few new characters, the existence of characters from other games, as well as the evil dragon. While the quality of the game story has been heavily criticized by some, I think it still has some interesting ideas to offer, but the opening doesn't allude to them much at all. Shame. The avatar creation process is similar to that of Three Houses, choosing a form, name, and birthday. The game's date is synced with real-time though, and the birthday bonus isn't super relevant whenever you get it, so Queen's birthday of November won't really be impactful. The prologue plays out similarly to Awakening's Premonition, taking place in a foreshadowing scene. There's just one boss to beat, and to do so, you can make use of the game's new mechanic. At least here, the new mechanic is actually required to win, and the pop-up tutorials make it obvious how to interact with it. By engaging, Queen gets a power-up for a few turns, earning them a new passive ability and a strong attack that never misses. Marth's ability, Divine Speed, is useful later on, but the main feature the prologue highlights is this powerful attack, Lodestar Rush. There's also a special cutscene from Queen engaging with Marth, adding to the perceived epicness of the new mechanic. Unlike the cutscenes, however, the flashiness here isn't carrying the mechanics, which are actually pretty fun to engage with. The story leading up to Chapter 1's battle is certainly odd, but it does set up the basis for the rest of the game. Clan and Fram immediately popping off of the player character who is literally their deity is a bit much, and this energy persisting throughout the entire game makes it noticeably difficult to approach in a serious manner. That being said, not all characters treat it to the extent the twins do, so while Chapter 1 may get you down, I know that it can only go up from here. The actual fight itself is pretty clean though. Vander is a satisfying Jagen-like unit, setting up kills for Queen. You are allowed to have the two sit in the forest, showing off terrain, but unfortunately this is actually bad on Maddening, in which enemies don't attack if they won't do damage, and Queen's personal skill that gives adjacent allies +3 damage dealt and -1 taken makes Vander too bulky for the enemies. I'm playing on Maddening mode, and so I have Vander move past the forests, leaving Queen behind. I almost set it up for all enemies to attack on the Queen and get killed, but the positioning forced one enemy to attack on Vander, stealing 1 kill from Queen and concluding this part's arc of Jagen stealing kills. Partway into the map, a whole cutscene actually triggers, showing the summoning of Marth and having him obliterate the corrupted going after Clan and Fram. Again, it's very flashy, further showing how much the game wants you to be excited to play it. Queen then gets teleported to the top half of the map, following with their movement in the cutscene. This time, we get to see the passive benefits of emblems. The stat boost to strength and speed, in addition to Divine Speed's bonus attack, lets Queen one round the corrupted, contrasting with her performance in the first half of the map. Humorously, the minor bonus healing effect she gets for being a dragon means that even if all the corrupted land their attacks, she can't die. Overall, a solid showing of the new mechanic, and emblems only get cooler and crazier as the game progresses. And that wraps up part 1 of the Fire Emblem Sync Marathon. Overall, I had a great time with this more segmented approach to playing all the games, and I hope it was fun to watch it unfold. I felt this part was particularly interesting, as all the maps were inherently connected in their goals of giving players a good first impression of the game and demonstrating how to play. There were a few types of approaches to achieving these goals that I noticed from each game. Firstly, some games use their first maps to give the player an open space for experimenting with the game's mechanics themselves, only giving limited information that the player couldn't figure out just from moving around, such as seizing with the Lord. This includes all the NES and SNES titles, in addition to Radiant Dawn, Awakening's Prologue, and even Three Houses. On the other hand, some games included maps meant to directly lead players through the movements of playing Fire Emblem, potentially involving characters giving specific advice on your next action. This includes the GBA and DS games, Path of Radiance, Fates, Shadows of Valentia, and Engage. At its best, I think that the experimental map approach is more appealing. Letting gameplay speak for itself is always impressive and allows for a more natural introduction to a game. If you don't successfully give the player enough information, but have difficult gameplay that requires tactical use of this information though, then the approach falls apart, and you're left with a poor opening of your game. I can see this being the case for the NES games and its rough controls, in addition to Thracia and the importance of the vaguely described capture mechanic. Meanwhile, Genealogy, Radiant Dawn, and Echo's Ram Woods all stood out to me as solid uses of this approach. I had a great time playing them, they got me adjusted to the game, and they weren't super obtrusive in laying out exactly what to do. I think the opposite, explicit tutorial approach has its merits when done well, of course. Even if it may seem a little patronizing to experienced gamers, it makes certain that new players will have a grasp on how to play the game once it does get interesting. Games like Binding Blade, Path of Radiance, and New Mystery makes these basic maps fun by incorporating the tutorial into the narrative, with characters giving commentary about what to do, potentially flowing into scenes showing the cast's bonds with each other. While I would like to see more experimental first maps in the future, I don't think that a fun, narrative-driven tutorial is a bad alternative, especially if experienced players have an option to just skip past it, like in Binding Blade and Fates. Separate from the maps themselves, I noticed that some games took greater care in their opening cutscenes and dialogue to get the player hooked on the entire game, narrative and characters included. This mostly was a linear progression, with games having a bigger focus on non-gameplay elements as the consoles improved and the fanbase developed. Some exceptions, however, include Genealogy and Thracia, as older games that actually present a well-thought-out world and characters with interesting connections. New Mystery and Shadows of Valentia's new content also give them a much stronger hook, with a greater emphasis on characters and story than the base game. On the other hand, Shadow Dragon doesn't expand on his predecessor all too much. We didn't play the prologue maps in this part though, and maybe they actually add to the narrative in meaningful and complex ways. Guess we'll never know though, since they're skipped in hard mode. Engage's lackluster content in its opening scenes, despite their flashy nature, also made me feel it ultimately relied on its gameplay to get players to have continued interest. It has references like the other remakes, yes, but not really to give a unique take on the old content. Rather, this fan service demonstrated immediately in the opening scenes almost acts as its own approach to getting players hooked, separate from gameplay and narrative. Alright, that's it for part 1. Considering the large scope of this project, my goal is to release these parts around once a month. Definitely look forward to the next part though, since I'll get to start establishing my teams past just the Lords. In Gaiden and Shadows of Valentia, we'll promote the villagers into some potentially non-standard options. We'll start pairing couples in Genealogy, and the prologues for New Mystery and Fates will wrap up. Also, I'm excited to show off Three Houses Chapter 1, not just for its ridiculously challenging map, but a certain funny strategy that I've utilized in all my 9 maddening playthroughs that I find endlessly entertaining. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in Part 2.